So this is the fourth time in the last 20 hours that I've given a message on these Bible verses. The two of them yesterday were both weddings. One was a couple named Craig and Stephanie. They usually come to this service, and their wedding was at a house, and it was a really cool wedding. It was actually at a house that had a swimming pool in the backyard, so they had their guests sit on one side of the swimming pool and kind of over on this side of the swimming pool, and me and them were on the other side of the swimming pool, and the flowers for girls were walking down. I've never prayed so hard at a wedding before that nobody falls in the pool. The wedding was a success. No one fell in the pool, and it was a really cool wedding. And the next one was a friend of mine I used to run marathons with when I was running a lot. And she called me up last year and said that she and her longtime boyfriend were getting married, and they were married out at Indian Creek Golf Course. And it's a beautiful day for a wedding. These are the flowers from my friend Laura's wedding. And one of the interesting things I always do with couples that I'm doing weddings for is I give them 10 Bible verses that I make them read. And the one that Betsy just read a little bit ago is one of those. And there's one from Colossians, there's one from Matthew, there's one from Genesis. They get to read all these, and I actually let them pick the Bible verses that they want. And without exception, without fail, I would say 8 or 9 out of 10 couples will choose the passage from 1 Corinthians 13 that Betsy just read a little bit ago. Now, what's interesting is Paul was not writing this to married couples. Paul was writing this to a church in Corinth. Now, Paul started this church. Paul had invested blood, sweat, and tears to get this church in Corinth off the ground. Corinth is, kind of where modern-day Greece would be. And, Paul was traveling all over Southern Europe, all over the Middle East, and all the jet planes were full, and he couldn't fly back there. So what Paul did is he wrote a letter to the church at Corinth, and this is what we know as the book of 1 Corinthians. Now, Paul was very disturbed about what was going on in the Corinthian church. What was happening is these people, they just weren't getting along. They were squabbling and disputing and arguing over a bunch of issues. And we pick this up in chapter 13, but we have to know what happens right before that in chapters 11 and 12. They're specifically arguing about the use of spiritual or charismatic gifts within the life of the church. And Paul, the guy's about ready to tear his hair out. Like, he's writing this letter, and you can just sense his frustration. As you read the early words in chapter 13, he says something like in chapter 13, verse 1, if you speak in tongues or in unknown languages and you don't have love, then the language that you speak is just like banging a cymbal. It's just noise. And it's not a very pleasant noise at that. And then in verse 2 it continues, and if you prophesy, if you speak to the people on behalf of God, and if you can think you have the gift to do that, but you don't have love, if you don't do it in love, then you ain't got nothing. So Paul says, there's these spiritual gifts, and you guys are arguing over whether these are valid or invalid. Some of you think you should do it, some of you don't, some of you don't care, and these are the things that you're fighting about. And I don't know how Paul did this. I don't know how he did this. You can just sense the frustration in verses 1 through 3. Then in verse 4, where Betsy picked up, I don't know if he took a break. I don't know if he prayed. I don't know if this just flowed from God's heart to his pen. But Paul writes some of the most beautiful words that have ever been written at any time in any language. What Paul does is he describes the heart of God. He describes the biblical definition of love better than anyone else has ever described it. Now, it's important to know that when Paul uses the Greek word agape here, it's not an adjective. It doesn't describe a way that we feel. It's a verb. It's something that we do. Now, in our 21st American century culture, I think a lot of times we say, I'm in love with her, or I'm in love with him, or I love that kid so much. And that really describes a feeling that we have. Now, that's not the biblical portrait of love. It's a wonderful thing. It's a blessed thing. And oftentimes it can be a byproduct of doing the love. We do the love and then we feel the love. But it's important to know that this is the biblical definition of love. It's not the American cultural definition of love. So then Paul says, here's what he says. To these people who are fighting, he says, love is patient and kind. It is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. Now think about that. Think about your interpersonal relationships. How are we doing in these areas? Are we patient? Are we kind? Are we boastful or proud or rude? Now, it even gets better. Paul says it does not demand its own way. It is not irritable. It keeps no record of being wrong. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever truth wins out. And then he talks about the perseverance of love. And he just gives us a glimpse here of what God's love for us is like, but then the challenge is that this is what our love for each other can look like. Instead of arguing over insignificant things, Paul says, I got a better way for you. And it's like this. Love never gives up. It never loses faith. It's always hopeful. It endures through every circumstance. So today's Mother's Day. And I think the pure love of a mother loving at her best, is about the most wonderful illustration. It provides the glimpse of this biblical model of love, the love that God has for us, and the love that God desires that we share with each other. I think a mother at her best is probably about the best example there is of biblical love. Now, I want to show you some pictures today. We're in this sermon series called Timeline, and if you ever are on any kind of social media, whenever I see pictures, I always look at them, because pictures are worth 1,000 words. You can try to describe some things, but there's nothing quite like a picture. So let's look at a picture of a young woman in our church, and this is some young women young mothers that have children. Now, just think about this. For mothers of young children, these words become very important. Patience. Unless your kids are a whole lot better than mine, patience is a good thing. Kindness, not being irritable, not demanding our own way. My mom's in town, and she was at the 9 o'clock service, and my two sons, Benjamin and David, they get along most of the time. The rest of the time, they don't get along. One of them is very skilled at antagonizing the other. The other is very skilled at retaliating back. So one day, I kind of had to correct Benjamin and David, and Benjamin asked me the question. He said, well, did you and Uncle Scott get along all the time? I'm like, yeah, of course. We never fought. I mean, brothers don't fight. They love each other. So he got Uncle Scott on the phone, and now Scott and I, we fought all the time. When we weren't fighting, we were sleeping. And even then, we were both dreaming about fighting with the other person. I mean, that was how we existed. But I'll tell you what, we're on the same page now. We're brothers. After 43 years from me and 50 years from him, we got the brother thing all figured out now. And Benjamin called him up. He said, hey, Uncle Scott, did you and Daddy ever fight when you were a kid? And Scott knew what he was asking. And he said, oh, no, we got along all the time. He said, you and your little brother in a dysfunctional relationship. So now Mom was here this weekend, and she is obliged to tell the truth. And excuse me. So Benjamin asked Mom, did Daddy and Uncle Scott fight when they were kids? And she goes, yeah, they fought when they were kids. Everyone fights when they're kids. And what moms get to do and what dads get to do, what parents get to do is we get to practice this biblical type of love. Now think about this. Think about this in all your interpersonal relationships. What would your interpersonal relationships look like? And I don't care what it is. It could be a marriage. It could be coworkers. It could be classmates. What would your relationships look like if you embodied kindness in everything that you did? What would your relationships look like if you embodied patience and practiced that, on a daily basis? This one, I think the one that's most challenging to me is Paul says that love's not irritable. What if for those 4 hours a day that I'm picking up kids and dropping them off from school at their respective schools, if I wasn't irritable? I just think how my life would just be so much more laid back and so much more easygoing. And instead of thinking, oh man, I'm losing time to sit in here, what if I thought about that? I get to spend an extra 2 or 3 minutes with my kid today. That's really cool. We get to talk. I'm not irritable. I think that I'm going to tell you a story, and I think this illustrates biblical love very well. So a few years ago, I had a computer. It was an Apple Macintosh. It was one of those old white ones, kind of bigger, a little bit clunky. Now we have a rule that the boys aren't supposed to have any kind of fluids around these computers. No juice, no Sprite, no milk, no water, whatever else they drink. So I couldn't get it to boot up one afternoon. I was very irritable. I wasn't being very patient, and I'm not convinced I was kind if anybody was around me. I took the battery out. I tried to plug it in. Nothing worked. So I took it to the Apple store. They take it to the Genius Bar. These geniuses, they figure all this stuff out, and they figured out that one of my kids, only one of the kids was home, so I knew which one it was. It wasn't, not to mention names, but it wasn't the older one. And there was some kind of fluid that was spilled in this computer, and I said, well, how much does this cost to fix? And he goes, well, $700. How much does a new computer cost? Like $1,200. So $1,200 later, I got a new computer. Take the new computer home. David's waiting for me. I said, hey, David, how's it going? Yeah, it's going great. I said, well, it's not going to be for very long. Now, do you think I love David any less because he spilled some juice on my computer? No. I love him just the same because he's my son. In this case, we don't love the other person because of what they've done. We love the other person because who we are and because who they are. At those weddings yesterday, Laura and Brian, the second couple, and even Craig and Stephanie, the first couple, I stand right in front of them, and I basically said something like this. If you guys got any chance at all in making this thing, here's how it's going to work. One of you is going to spill some juice in the computer or something very similar. And you're not going to love the other person because of what they did. You're going to love the other person because he's your husband. You're going to love the other person because she is your wife. Now, the best example of biblical love is Jesus himself. And he doesn't love us because we gossiped. He doesn't love us because we lied. He doesn't love us because we took something. He loves us because of his own integrity and his own character. Therefore, grace is not something that we earn. It's something that we can only freely receive because of his benevolence and because of his generosity. Now, when Paul says that love keeps no record of wrongs, and he gives this as one of the descriptions of biblical love, I think that this is what he's talking about. Now, on October 17th of 1995, the world welcomed two beautiful twin girls, Kyrie and Brielle Jackson. Now, these girls were born in Massachusetts. They were twin sisters. They arrived 12 weeks before their due date. Typically what happens in neonatal ICUs like that is they'll keep the twins in separate incubators to minimize the possibility of infections. So Kyrie, who was born at 2 pounds and 3 ounces, was thriving and doing very well. Her heart was getting stronger. Her color was very good. She was growing and developing almost every day. Now, her sister Brielle, who was born 3 ounces lighter, she weighed 2 pounds. She was experiencing problems. She wasn't growing nearly as much. Her oxygen levels were low, and she constantly cried. So about a month later, on November 12th, tiny Brielle went into critical care. It was very touch and go whether the girl would live. She gasped for air, she turned bluish, her heart rate soared, her temperature dropped. The parents, the nurses, they watched in terror, they watched in disbelief that something like this was happening. Now, as within these moments, there was a nurse whose name was Gail Kasparian, and she took action. Now, after all the conventional remedies just didn't seem to be working, she did something that wasn't really done much in the United States, but was done frequently overseas, especially in Western Europe. What she did is she took tiny Brielle and she moved her into the incubator with her sister, Kyrie. Now, the picture that you're going to see up here won the Pulitzer Prize back in 1995 for the best photojournalistic picture that was taken that year. Now you can see that the healthy sister put her arm over the younger sister who was struggling. And they call this picture the rescue hug. Now you have to know that in life, there's some things that love is the only answer for. You know, Paul was talking about people who are arguing over charismatic spiritual gifts. But when Betsy read those words a little bit ago, and when I read them again, I have a feeling that those words pretty much jumped off the page at all of us, because those words are the heartbeat of God. And I think Paul knew this as well, that when he wrote this letter, it wasn't just to a bunch of people in Corinth who couldn't get along, but it would be to generations and generations and generations of people that these words would nourish. Now, I want to show you a picture of the girls. This is 17 years later. They still live in the same room together. They live in Massachusetts, and they teach us this essential lesson that Paul wrote nearly 2,000 years ago. Love never gives up. Love always endures through every circumstance. It never gives hope. There are some things in life that only biblical love will do. You know, I've talked a lot about the worship service that Benjamin and I do at the Good Samaritan home on Q Street. I think it's probably like 128th Street or something like that. And, you know, on Friday afternoons, once a month, Benjamin and I will go to the nursing. We've done this for 7 years. Benny's grown up there. He's a little guy now. He's almost as big as me now, at least vertically. He's got some ways to go the other way. But every time I go there, this woman, her name was Harriet, you know, she was there almost when we started. And every time I was there, she would come up to me afterward and she said, "Will you do my funeral?" Now, I always tried to avoid and kind of dodge this question. It's kind of an odd question for a pastor. But, you know, I mean, she just wore me out. Finally, I'll do it. Yeah, we'll do it. Hope it doesn't happen anytime, but yes, I'll do your funeral. You know, next month, will you do my funeral? Yeah, I'll do your funeral. I mean, I don't want to have it happen anytime soon, but I'll do it. You know, do my funeral. I'm going to do your funeral. So then one day, I get a phone call. There's a funeral director. He asked for, when everyone ever calls me and asks for pastor, I know it's always a funeral director. It's like, "Pastor, you know, Harry just died," and I knew who he was talking about. And he says, "You know, can you do her funeral on Thursday? Does that work for you?" And I said, "Of course it works." I told her I'd do the funeral. I'll do the funeral. You know, it actually wasn't in Omaha. She had a niece that lived in Omaha. It was actually about 2.5 hours away. So that Thursday morning, I got up early and I looked at my wardrobe, and I have 2 suits. I have the suit where I'm running about 50 or 60 miles a week. Then I have the suit where I'm running 0 miles a week. And I picked out the suit that fit me better at the time. And I went and I put gas in the car. And I always do this on funerals. I always wash my car that day. I just always do it. I've always done it. You know, so I got in the car and I drove some more. And I got to the little Lutheran church where the funeral was going to be held. You know, I asked, I said, "Is there family I can talk to?" I mean, I don't really know her that well. I talk to her on, you know, every 4th Friday, but I just don't know her that well. And he said, "No, it's just, you know, that the other person in Omaha is the niece." And, you know, the niece was a little bit younger than me. She had a little baby. And I got to the church, and the funeral director saw me, and he says, "Well, I want to introduce you to Harriet's mom." I'm like, "What?" Like, Harriet's like 85. He says, "Yeah, her mom's 102. So I met this woman, and I, you know, told her I was sorry. I talked to her for a little bit. Yeah, so during the funeral, the niece sat by the mother. The baby was in the middle, and the niece's husband was kind of over here. It's this little church in rural Nebraska. I got done, and during the message, the baby got really unruly, started crying, so the niece got up and left with the baby. And the organist started to play, the singer started to sing, and they were playing Amazing Grace. And, I just locked my eyes on that 102-year-old woman, that was sitting in the front row. And she broke down. She started crying. She sat down and just, I could see the tears flowing from her face. She's sitting like this. Her hands are over her head. I'm like, there is no one. There's no one that should have to sit alone. When your daughter's dead in a casket 6 feet away from you. So I got up out of my chair and I went and sat by her. I put my arm around her. She put her head on my shoulder. I thought about so much when that was going on. I thought about all the diapers that woman changed, all the tears that she wiped away, all the joys that she shared, the unfulfilled hopes, the dreams that came true. And I thought about her broken heart. Probably for 85 years, she had been that girl's mom. And then I listened to the words to the song, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shine as the sun. There's a place for us that Jesus has given us. And then I actually thought about this text from 1 Corinthians, that love never gives up. Love always endures. It never fails. And then I thought, and I was thinking about this week, when we go through those trials and tribulations of life, God is going to be a whole lot more faithful than any pastor. God comes and he holds us in his arms, just like a mother holds a crying baby. That God gives us strength, that God gives us power, that God gives us his resources, he gives us his presence, he gives us his care. And I think this is what Paul was talking about when he talks about this biblical love, that it endures through every circumstance. Now I want to give you a biblical picture of what I think this biblical love looks like. I want to show you another picture. This is a picture of a father and a son from the Bible. You can't see it well, there's some light pollution up there, I guess, but this is the story of the lost son and the loving father. Maybe some of us know it as the story of the prodigal son. The boy goes up to the dad and he asks for his share of the estate. Now, it's not half the estate. Back then the older son would have been favored and probably would have gotten 2/3 to 3/4 of the estate. So the son was actually asking for probably about 25 to 33% of the family's resources. And the dad knew this was wrong. The dad knew this was not right, but at the same time, he knew that he was going to teach this kid a lesson that would change this kid's life forever. So the kid goes away and he blows all the money, spends it all, doesn't have a nickel to his name. The Bible says that he ends up wishing that he could eat the food that he was feeding to the pigs, just to try to make a go of things. And then we get this wonderful, incredible, marvelous picture of what biblical love actually is. The son had had enough, and he says, I'm going to return home. And even if I have to work as one of my father's hired hands, it's going to be a whole lot better than trying to, steal food from some of these pigs. So he's on his way home, and then Luke, who writes this story, or Jesus who tells the parable, gives us this picture of biblical love. When the father sees the son in the distance, he runs and he goes and he embraces the son. What that teaches us, just that one little line, what that teaches us is that the father, and Jesus starts off the story, for the kingdom of heaven is like two brothers. One of them went to the dad. This is what the kingdom of heaven is like. God was waiting for the son to return home. He was anticipating this. Even though the son had messed up, even though the son had blown 1/3 of the family's resources, there was no resource that was more valuable than this son to him. He goes and he embraces the kid. He kisses him. He puts his a ring on his finger and he says, we're going to throw a party because my son was once lost and now he's found. Now, it wasn't that the son deserved this love. And, some of us, when we read the story for the first time or we hear this story, we think, how can this guy not tell the son, I told you so? You're a complete idiot. You went out and blew all this stuff. This is what I told you was going to happen. Now, that's not the way that the older dad worked. It's not the way that the kingdom of heaven works. He embraces the lost. He keeps no record of wrongs. Love never loses hope. I just think of all those nights that man was out on his porch, out on his deck, out in the lawn, just waiting for the son to return home. He never lost hope. Love never loses hope. Now, there's just one more picture I want to show you. And this is a picture of Mary and Jesus. Now, Paul has given us the definition of Christian love, and he has done as best as he could. He said it's patient and it's kind. It doesn't envy. It doesn't boast. It keeps no record of wrongs. It always endures. It always hopes. It lasts forever. You're not going to do better than that. But what God has done himself has given us not just a definition of love. He has given us the personification of love. He has given us the person of love who is Jesus Christ. Now, if you look at what Jesus did, he absolutely lived out what Paul said that love was. If you look at Jesus and the disciples, how can this guy not get frustrated with the ineptness of these 12 people? Yet Jesus was always patient, and he was always kind. Jesus went around and, he forgave people left and right for what they did and what they didn't do. He kept no record of wrongs. Think about all the people that went up and just bugged Jesus. Jesus was never irritable. Some of my favorite stories are near the end of Jesus' life when even the men that killed him, what Jesus said? God, give them what they deserve. No, that's not what he said. He said, Lord, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. And it talks about hope, and it endures all things, and hope never fails. There's this thief on the cross, and one of the last acts that Jesus did is he was here on this planet, is he looked at this man, he said, even though you've messed up, you will be with me forever in paradise. Even till the end, he was still giving hope. So to all the moms out there, I want to say this. We want to thank you because when you're at your best, you have given us a glimpse and an illustration of what the love of God is like. For all of us who haven't been at our best, we have to understand that God's love is greater than any of us could ever imagine, greater than any of us could ever dream. That God's grace is bigger than our shortcomings. And because of his love, we get to live as forgiven people. And just like we are loved by God. What God desires from each of us is for those of us who have received this love to share it with the world that we live in. So we are simultaneously both loved and loving. So let us pray.